Jazz activist Ira Gitler was wearing a downbeat t-shirt and listening to Art Tatum with his wife of 46 years, Mary Jo Schwalbach, when he died at the age of 90 on February 23, 2019.
I first met Ira Gitler when I started writing for Downbeat in the late 70s, and he was really affable and encouraging. About 20 years later, on the eve of his 80th birthday, I spoke to him about Ray Charles.
And it wasn't a big apartment, it's a tiny apartment, but Ira had so many CDs and records. Like the CDs were in this little tiny courtyard, all packed up in tubs, like Rubbermaid tubs or something.
Ira's crib was a warehouse of jazz memorabilia that he had collected during his distinguished career, and a lot of Mary Jo's artwork. We spoke about his life in jazz.
Jazz was just natural to me when I first heard it. I just absorbed it.
It touches a part of my life, touches my heart and soul, and just animates my soul in a way that very few things in this world do.
Coleman Hawkins playing Body and Soul made me cry the first time I heard it. It was so beautiful. I guess it just touched something in there.
But Ira would probably be the truest writer of all, seriously. When he gave you a review, I don't think he always looked for the best in you and found out what you did that he liked. Not what he disliked, but what he liked.
You know, he was very positive in most of his writings, and musicians liked him because he said nice things about them.
In my junior year, the guy who was doing the jazz column, can you imagine that? The high school newspaper had a jazz column. Well, he graduated, so he had been ahead of me, and I guess I was a junior when he was doing the column as a senior. So I was recruited to do the jazz column, where I imposed myself. The first piece I wrote on jazz that was published was Dizzy Gillespie at the Spotlight, 1946.
1945, when I came out of the service, Ira was a young kid. Talking to him, it wasn't phony. It was like I was talking to one of my musician friends who really knew Bert.
I think, he was one of the first writers to champion bebop, and he was particularly in love with Charlie Parker. I mean, he took up the alto, which he never succeeded in. And I don't think he would blame me for saying that he never got to play it very well. But it was just another expression of his passion for Bird and for bebop.
I actually got to play with Ira once, and it was an event at the New School, and they had all the critics who wrote were going to play. So Dick Sudhalter played the trumpet, I played the tenor, Whitney Balliet played drums, Bill Crow played the bass, Ira played the alto, and the funniest thing was, in the front row, Jimmy Heath and Clark Terry were sitting there with notebooks, like, it was really great.
We drove down to the session. It was at Apex on West 57th. That's where a lot of jazz recording was done in those days. And that's when Stan did Long Island Sound. That was the first record date I actually went to.
The thing about Ira that was so appealing was his real love for the music. People call us critics or whatever, but I think he looked upon himself as a kind of elevated fan.
He was in the trenches. It seemed like he knew the musicians, he knew the music, he was there, and this is what happened.
In '50, I left school. Bob asked me to work at Prestige. I would pack the records, unpack the records, and sweep the floor. Visit DJs with the new releases and write label copy, write ad copy for the ads in Downbeat. Go to a lot of the sessions, and by PRLP 117, which was a Zoot Sims session, where he broke the minute barrier by just closing his eyes and going on and on. And Bob said, "You're the writer, write some notes. I'll make you famous, man." And that was it.
Through the records and the record bins, and then turning them over and realizing that the great majority of stuff that you would encounter was drivel. And then there were a handful of people that you would start to read, say, "Oh, not only is it not drivel, but it's good. And not only is it good, but I'm actually learning something." And then you would get to the point where you'd actually be looking to read the liner notes. You didn't care so much about who was on the record. I'm talking in the record store. And just sit there and get an education. I mean, the record store was like a library. So that's when I became aware of the name of Ira Gitler.
Started seeing his name on the back of albums, particularly prestige albums. I was reading him, in downbeat and reading his liner notes. So he became a very large luminary in my cosmos, in my jazz cosmos. He was a hero before I even knew him.
Going to the Jazz Record Mart, which I discovered on my 17th birthday. They were having a big sale. I went right down when I saw the advertisement. I fell in love with this place. And that's where I could stand at the record bins reading the liner notes by Ira. I mean, really principally, because the Nat Hentoff notes that I got a lot out of, they were on the inside of those Impulse jackets. Ira's were on the outside.
So I had once on one of our trips, I had been just, high-fiving him on the sheets of sound. I said, "You've been great, man. You got a phrase that's going to outlive you." Or you coin a phrase that becomes like this standard part of our lexicon. And, I congratulated him and he thanked me and all that. And then we started talking about a very progressive saxophonist in the early 80s. Who flirted with the avant-garde and all that. And we were talking about him. He was a darling of that era. And Ira was laughing because he said that guy wasn't about sheets of sound. That guy was about the sound of sheet. And I thought, that's very, very artful turn of a phrase, Ira, the sound of shit. And so he was funny because he took his very own creation, he morphed it out and just made it even more of a thing for me to process.
Miles did Dig and Denial and Paper Moon and that whole session with Sonny and Jackie McLean. And Sonny played so well that day, despite squeaking a few times. The reed was giving him trouble. I guess Bob was finally convinced, and he offered him a contract. And the first date was in December, and Bob, as I said, didn't want to go in the studio anymore for a period of time. And he said, you do the session. Can you imagine that? Here I am on the eve of my 23rd birthday, producing Sonny Rollins.
Get in the time machine and go back and, go to Minton's and, see Charlie Christian and Charlie Parker and Monk, and Bud Powell and all these great musicians. Well, he was there. He knew all of these guys.
Sonny concocted this Mambo Bounce, which was a mambo rhythm blues coming out of the head, though it went into 4/4. It was a little tricky. And they just couldn't get it. And so we did many takes. And I had been to some sessions, so I had some idea of what went on at a session. And I said, let's forget this for a while and go on to some other thing. Kenny was nodding out at the piano between takes, and Art Blakey would play his famous press roll ending in a crash, and Kenny would come up from the piano. It was kind of nasty of Art, but he was getting a kick out of it. There was some rough times for him. He didn't have a neck strap, made one out of a wire hanger and some rope. And finally, we got through Mambo Bounce. It wasn't quite smooth transition, but we got it. It was my indoctrination and his first as a leader.
Downbeat in those days, it was really a great place to learn about the music. I mean, it was written for the jazz fan, but if you were an entrance level beginner, you could learn a great deal from the reviews and the feature articles and stuff. And those were, you quickly learn the guys whose taste is similar to yours. Ira was, definitely one of those guys.
I go back to the year 1959 or 1960, so I was either 14 or 15. And one of my favorite records, or my favorite record at that time, was Cannonball Adderley live in San Francisco. Cannonball Adderley Quintet with a great tune, Dis Here, on it. And one of my father's favorite records was Time Out by Dave Brubeck. And Ira gave both those records 2 stars, maybe 2.5 stars for Cannonball, complaining about the really sarcastic reviews too. Funny, but sarcastic. So I got really mad at him, even though I had never met him. But I remember reading those reviews. I was in a drugstore, and I got all PO'd. He was a good-natured guy. The next issue, there was a picture of Cannonball and Dave Brubeck strangling him. So that was really my most vivid recollection of his wit, so to speak. In fact, there are all 3 of those guys. They were all great guys.
You want to be able to react, try to get inside the music. In the early days of writing liner notes, we used to describe every song, which necessarily you don't have to do, but that's one method. I know it helped DJs a lot. The challenge is always to try to be yourself, get into the musician you're talking about and what makes he or she unique.
I ended up producing a Paul Blake concert at Town Hall in New York around 1968. And afterwards, we all went to Don Preston's loft. I was sitting in a circle with Barry Elchnell and Ira. And Barry introduced me to Ira, and Ira said, "So I hear you write for Jazz and Pop for free." I said, "Well, yeah." He said, "How'd you like to write for Downbeat and get paid?" And I said, "Shit, yeah, I'd love to." And so he started giving me assignments, which was, I thought, very generous. I was just like 18 or 19 years old. And, Downbeat was the place to be, if you wanted to publish and be taken seriously.
Ira reported information and, really gave you a sense of what was there. And he had definitely an urban sensibility.
Ira had that New York Jewish thing.
Gene Ammons is Jewish. Ray Charles is very Jewish. Al Jolson Goyish.
Ira was a post-World War II Jewish Brooklyn guy who happened to know my father-in-law and my father-in-law's friends. They shared this kind of bebop hipster mentality, which celebrated, of course, Lester Young, but it also celebrated Lenny Bruce.
If I start to really analyze my humor, I guess every bit of it stems from some societal problem or people's concept that I think is hypocrisy.
They were kind of street guys who had a kind of intellectual yet sardonic yet very funny take on the world.
I grew up in baby boomer suburbia in the 50s and the 60s, and thanks to an excellent music education program, I started playing the trumpet when I was in 4th grade. I'd hang out in record stores, reading the liner notes, and I devoured each issue of Downbeat from cover to cover. Then came Lenny Bruce, and listening to Gene Shepard every night on the radio, and subscribing to the Village Voice with the listings of everything that was happening, and then the Realist for a completely different take on the world politically, especially after the Kennedy assassination. I can't forget Maynard G Krebs, the first bongo-playing beatnik who dug Monk and Miles in a sitcom on network TV.
These guys had kind of a worldview that was all about bebop into hipster, into ultimately hippie, I was taken by it all. I felt that it was a very kind of people-friendly view of the world that prized humor, attitude, laughter, creativity, and hipness, of course.
A lot of cats put you on, Mr. Wick, but you really play with a lot of soul, baby. You remind me a lot of Bird.
I want to tell you, Paul Desmond really cooked his ass off. Because everybody from Sonny Stitt to Herb Geller sounds like Bird, and at least Desmond's got his own sound.
And those were very, very alluring ways to be for me as a young person. Still are, actually.
I was never comfortable with conformity, so the outsider status had great meaning and appeal to me, and I embraced it when I was 13 or 14. I wore a Dizzy Gillespie for President button to school every day.
The initial kind of rogue status of it all, the outsider thing, was very powerful. It felt to me like that is membership in an exclusive club.
Not that necessarily everybody who played great was a nice guy, but in general, I found most of the jazz musicians that I met and hung out with and knew pretty much great people.
I think both the music and the people that are drawn to it share a certain kind of a community that is extremely special, because the music is what's keeping you together. And the community of jazz really allows people to tell their own story in their own way. That's what makes it truly a community.
The power of Ira and Dan and Nat was that they helped substantiate the path for me. The fact that the literature existed and that I was able to tap into it proved a great validator for me. That, hey man, I like this stuff. I don't just like the music, but I like the people who make the music. Thus, I like the people who enable the making of the music. And so all of a sudden, what Ira had done his whole life became a kind of North Star for me.
There was a warmth and a love that was manifest in Ira Gitler. He's one of the best friends our music ever had.
Ira was very much a personality and a person with a point of view and an artist of what he did. I mean, he stood for something. He stood for a way of writing about the music. He stood for a way of thinking about the music. And he stood a way of being about the music.
He was pretty down-to-earth, street guy, great writer, really knew the music, and he wasn't locked in one groove. He had big ears.
There wasn't a shred of affectation. You never felt that there was an agenda with Ira Gitler.
He was approachable. And that even as a teenager, if you had a question or something to talk about, he'd be willing to talk to you. And you never felt like, hey, kid, don't waste my time, or I'm a big shot or something like that.
And what mattered to him was the creation of this music by these musicians. So for me, there's a great humanitarian effort behind everything he did, far, far beyond what we might assign to the term jazz critic. And I think it was very deep, and it actually is bigger than music. It's about people, and it's about mankind, and I think Ira was right there on it.
Well, I missed Al and Zoot very much because they were very close personal friends.
When I first met Zoot in St. Louis in 1947, he was playing with Woody Herman's band, and I had hitchhiked in from Columbia, Missouri to hear the new Woody Herman band, the new edition that was traveling east from L.A., and here I saw this guy. I had heard about Jackie Sims, but I had never heard of, and he had this hunting cap on with the ear flaps, and I said, who is this guy? And he looks like a country boy. Well, Zoot was a country boy with city sophistication.
I miss Miles a lot because we had a bond, even though we didn't see each other, all the time. But whenever we did, there was a certain feeling. Naturally, Bird was missed from the moment he left. So many of them, because a lot of them I developed, if not deep friendships, strong relationships. Bud Johnson, I felt, to me, he was like my uncle. Dexter is very missed. Great personality, great wit. Sports, which has been very important to me, particularly hockey. As a fan, as a player, as a coach.
He had his own team, Gitler's Gorillas, and he was very good on the ice. He wrote a couple of books about hockey, one with the somewhat frightening name of Blood on the Ice. He introduced me to that game. He called it the world's fastest sport.
You know, ate, slept, and drank jazz and hockey for his whole life, and he lived his life the way he wanted to.
I got these wonderful books, Jazz Masters of the 20s, the 30s. He wrote one of them, Jazz Masters of the 40s. And that's when I began to realize that not only was he writing liner notes or producing concerts or producing records, but that he had been witness to a certain kind of era and was bringing something to it that was different.
The whole essence of the music is my greatest joy, because when it's played with the feeling that has been part of it since the beginning, it has the essence of the blues, a certain kind of spirit, and it's got a joy in it that gives joy. Bird's solo on Funky Blues, I mean, that tells it all. It's bittersweet, it's sad, but it's also singing of life. Dichotomy, but they come together, they separate. But they tell a lot of stories, and the ability of the master musicians to express their personalities within the music.
Of the senior critics in the 80s and 90s, he was really among the first of the older guys to really embrace new talent. Roy Hargrove came out. I mean, a lot of the older guys were sleeping on him, and Ira was just in there.
In New York, pretty much, you know, if you're in the business part of it, everybody knows everybody. It's really a small world, and particularly if you're in the end of the business that I'm in, you know, promoting music and promoting artists and events and things. You know, you pretty much get to know everybody in the business. The record label people, the writers, the radio people, etc. Yeah, and Ira was a big part of that. When he had to go into the assisted living facility, I was pretty saddened by that, you know, and because that meant he was off the scene.
I visited him probably a year ago at his home, the assisted living home. It was a stark reminder for me. He didn't know me at all. He could not recognize me. Mary Jo had encouraged me to come. Kaskuna encouraged me, Dan, and I wanted to go see him. So I went to see him. He didn't know me at all. And it was a little unsettling to be in that position. However, we did have a momentous occasion of sorts. While I was searching for things to say and ways to connect, I noticed that on his night table there was a boombox and a cassette of Bud Powell music. So when I said, Ira, would you like to hear some Bud, you know? And he nodded, and I put the cassette in, and it totally altered his countenance. He got upright, he got kind of cheerful, there was a joy thing going on, almost as if the portion of his brain dedicated to memory regarding Bud Powell, it got activated, and it alone got him back into the groove, so to speak, in ways that any conversation that I could offer could achieve. I mean, I just wasn't getting anywhere with him. He was, you know, I'm assuming it was full-blown dementia. He just wasn't connecting with me, but he did connect with Bud. I thought that was remarkable.
There's the famous session with Charlie Parker and Sonny.
Let's talk about that.
Oh, that was a rough day.
Why?
Well, Miles came late. Bob had always wanted to have Bird and Prez on his label. He never got Prez, but he got Bird. And Bird was, of course, under contract to Norman Granz. He played tenor instead of alto, which made it a little different. I decided to get a bottle of gin and 12 beers. There was 6 musicians and myself waiting around for Miles. Bird just took the bottle and in 2 chug-a-lugs left about yay much in it. And then proceeded to not nod out. He wasn't using heroin, but, you know, kind of drift off a couple of times. But, you know, played beautifully. Made it sound like a baritone. But the problem was they were trying to read these charts for the first time. Miles's chops were not good. They were breaking down. And, you know, with that late start, it was getting late. We weren't getting anything done. I don't know what possessed me. It was not premeditated. I just thought maybe I'd give Miles a goose. And I said, Miles, you ain't playing shit. Well, with that, perhaps because maybe he wanted to leave, he started, I think he was bluffing in the end, but he started packing up his horn. And I said, you know, I didn't really mean that. I was just trying to get you going. And he's saying to the other guys, Cat says I'm not playing shit, you know. I talked him out of it because I saw my job walking out the door with him. Okay, we got going again. We got 2 takes of the Serpent's Tooth. I named the Serpent's Tooth out of a phrase in Shakespeare, which was apropos. It was getting very late. It got to be 5 o'clock, and Bob Lee says he had to leave, and a new engineer came in, and he announced that the studio was closing at 6 o'clock. Nobody had ever told me that. Studios didn't close. You paid overtime, you know, but studios just didn't close. By this time, it was about 5:30, and we didn't have that much material. It was getting down to 0 hour, and I had a brainstorm to play around midnight because it takes up a lot of time. It's a very slow-paced number, very measured. It turned out to be kind of a very somber, well, it is a somber kind of song. It kind of had the feeling of that day, but to me it was a masterpiece. As they finished, the sweep second hand reached the top, and it was 6 o'clock on the nose.